We've been hearing from the retail end of things and from record companies, and we're just going to hear one more viewpoint from record companies and then go to two impartial experts who sit from a vantage point of being able to view all this stuff going on, who are going to give us their take on what we've been hearing so far. But first, I would like to ask Jane if she would tell us something.
Hello, okay. I've worked in A&R at 4AD for about 6 years now, and actually would have been one of Gary's peers that started our label. He worked at the Beggars Banquet record shop, and bands used to come in and bring their demos into the shop or their CDs to sell direct from there. And one of the bands that came in was a band called The Modern English, and they gave it to Ivo, and he liked it so much that he told Martin Mills, who also had the Beggars Banquet label and owned the store, you should release this band. And he said, how about instead of me releasing this band, I give you a loan of £2,000 and you start your own label. And that is how 4AD came to be. So 32 years later, I'm proud to represent the label here and very fortunate to work with really great bands, including Stornoway, who I can see. Hello. Basically, if you want to get into A&R, people always ask me, how do you get into A&R? The answer is you really have to be a scout first, or I guess nowadays you can go into it from being a blogger or, you know, from that kind of route as well. But actually, I owe a lot to DIY culture because I was a musician too, and when I left university, I went on a tour of the west coast of America with some DIY artists, and the entire tour was arranged on the K Records message board. So we played at a lot of people's houses, and we, you know, stayed on a lot of people's floors, and it was a really great experience. And a lot of the time, you would just pass around a tin and be like, petrol money or gas money, because you're in America. You know, and then that would be how we would get to the next town. So that was a month-long tour, and when I came back at the end of that tour, I just had armfuls of really amazing new music that, you know, nobody that I knew in the UK had heard of before. And because I'd interned at 4AD while I was still at university, the first thing I did was went in there and said, look at all these great, you know, bands I found. And in fact, one of them was the Dirty Projectors, and that was back in 2005. And they were like, gosh, you know, that's, you know, awfully interesting. You should be our scout. So that was how I became a scout. And then from there, you know, I've worked with some really great bands. One of the first things I came across when I was scouting was Bon Iver, who has since become one of our biggest acts.
Your discovery?
It was. Well, right. My discovery at 4AD.
Yeah. Right.
So yeah, that was when I was very green behind the ears. So my boss at the time, he signed Bon Iver, and I'm Bon Iver's product manager. And then after that, they were like, oh, we better give her a full-time job. So that was how I went full-time. And since then, I've signed Tuneyards and Grimes. Well, thank you.
Well, that's a big round for that.
Make me blush. So Tuneyards is a really interesting example because when I first heard Tuneyards, it was on MySpace, and she recorded her entire album on a digital dictaphone that she then put through GarageBand, and she was actually releasing that as a vinyl-only release, or no, maybe it was cassette-only. No, it was cassette-only, then vinyl as well, where she had, interestingly, they had taken old LPs and they screen printed over the front covers and glued them like inside out, and that was her album. So, you know, I heard this very lo-fi music full of digital distortion, and to most people it was probably really unlistenable, but to me I just fell in love with it, and could just hear so much like promising, strong melody behind it and personality behind it. So I flew to Montreal to meet her and see her play in a warehouse, and it was actually her 30th birthday party, and it was meant to just be her and her friends doing some lullabies. So she decided she would make it into a real gig, and that was, you know, I was like, basically like, I will do anything, I want to work with you. And she had never heard of 4AD, so it was, you know, quite a struggle to get her to trust us. But it was great. So, you know, DIY culture is something that is really important, because you can really kind of start things off yourself, and then by doing that, with all the new ways of getting your music out there, someone will come across your music and probably be able to give you an opportunity you wouldn't have otherwise had. And even with acts that we've, you know, that maybe are a bit more established, we're always using kind of, referring back to DIY culture. You know, the 4AD sessions is another thing that, you know, we have been working on in the last few years, and that was born out of Bradford Cox from Deer Hunter cancelling a promo trip. And he was sitting in our meeting room and said, I want to go to a real studio and make some music. And so we said, okay. And then they called me because I was a musician and I was in this ridiculous band who were recording in this cool analog studio. And I kicked my band out of the studio and took him in. And then he made like this, you know, like set of, actually it was kind of reworkings of Microcastle mainly that he just did, and in one continuous stream. And my bandmate said, oh wow, that's great, you should make it a cassette. And it ended up being, you know, made into 200 cassettes and being the first 4AD session. So out of, you know, DIY elements, it kind of is so good for creativity. Like, you know, that's something that we've developed now, and we've done sessions with, you know, St. Vincent and Stornoway and Bon Iver, and, you know, they're being seen all over the world. So, yes.
But would you say that 4AD is now part of the mainstream?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're just borrowing from DIY culture, for sure. Yeah, we are a serious record label.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jane Abernethy. So, Daniel, Ian was talking a bit earlier on about how the DIY, even the artists who start out DIY, all seem to have their eye on a mainstream deal sooner or later, so that, you know, there was the Lily Allen Arctic Monkeys at the beginning of the MySpace age, and they went straight to the majors. And then I mentioned that we've had Rizzle Kicks, Ed Sheeran, people like that. They've still done it DIY up to a certain point, but then they've gone mainstream again. From where NME is perceiving all this going on, do you think that people can now make it all the way into the mainstream without making that compromise, or is that an inevitable part of it?
Well, I mean, I think in the very act of forming a band in the first place, that's a DIY thing to do. You can't do anything without, you know, picking up a guitar, finding a place to rehearse, writing some songs, getting the van. Just everybody from the start is that. I mean, in that sense, you know, there isn't really a distinction, and everybody who forms a band, well, actually not everybody who forms a band, but I think you should want to have hits, you should want to have an audience. You know, there's certain artists that don't, who prefer to be under the radar, that's fine too. But if we're talking about rock and roll or pop music or whatever this is, then you want to be in that mainstream. You know, what's changed hugely is the methods of getting there, and obviously, you know, it used to be that artist would be picked up by a major label very early on, supported for 2 years, sort of on the way so they can give up their jobs, practice for 2 years, then get there. Nowadays, you know, the journey is probably a lot harder, you know, there's a lot more options of which way you can get there, but I think the end point that you're aiming for really is the same, and that, you know, as much as everything always changes, the basics of it never do, you know.
So still, in order to get that global lift-off, you're going to need the help of people who've got those global contacts?
Not necessarily global, you know, it can go in different ways from different you know, for different artists. I mean, the Arctic Monkeys, by the way, they absolutely hated from the very beginning the mention that they were this MySpace band. I mean, that's what, ironically, you know, in the mainstream, that's what made people notice. And they were the MySpace band. They absolutely hated that. But what they did have was a very local, strong support network. In fact, a guy called Jeff, who was local manager, and for 2 years drove them to their gigs. You know, he's now, you know, remained their manager. They got global people in, but they have, I suppose, a very good example of someone who started it, you know, absolutely from the DIY thing, and they've just done it step by step by step into being this global band. I mean, someone like Lily Allen, obviously, she came from a very, you know, she had very good contacts from the very beginning, so she was able to do it by MySpace, but at the same time, it wasn't quite DIY in the same way, you know, that somebody like Bon Iver was, or indeed Arctic Monkeys.
So the way that the technology has changed in the last, particularly the last 7 years since YouTube, surely that has just changed the whole playing field, though, because we were hearing that previously you had to get into NME or be played on John Peel, or nobody would ever know you existed. At least now there's the kind of multiple choice options, isn't there?
Yes, there is. I mean, this is, I think, one of the debates we're having this debate to try and get to the bottom of, and I don't think there really is an answer. All of this new technology obviously is wonderful. Everyone can self-publish, self-produce to an extent, get their music out. Why I still think there are a need for magazines and radio stations is that, and indeed labels in some form, whether they be majors or however they're funded, is that there still needs to be that filter. There still needs to be somebody whose job it is to sit around listening to everything so they can filter out all the crap to tell, you know, the public who don't have the time to do that what is good, you know. At the same time, it's probably not a popular viewpoint, but there needs to be some kind of powerful people who have a lot of money that can take a band who are kind of there, let them give up their job in a factory, let them practice for 2 years till they're brilliant, and then, you know, that's where we get our rock stars from. There are other ways to do it, but I think their stories are becoming flukier and they're becoming fewer and further between, and that, I think, is a cause for concern.
Okay. Daniel Martin.